Okay, so you ever just stop and think about how weird it is that we like divide the world up into like stuff and things?
Yeah, I guess I never really
It's kind of like,
thought about it that way.
it's so basic, but
Yeah,
like think about it. If you, I don't know, lose your appendix, right? That's one less thing in the world, straightforward. But if you like donate blood, that feels more like you've lost some stuff, not a thing.
yeah, I see what you mean.
Or like a sandcastle, kids build on the beach, it's a thing, a sandcastle. But then the tide comes in, washes it away, the castle's gone, poof, but all that sand is obviously still there.
Right, right. It's not like the sand itself disappeared, just the castle.
You count cakes, right? I baked 3 cakes. But no one says they have like 3 cakes. You have cake, the stuff, and then you have individual cakes.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's like there's the general category and then these particular instances of it.
And then like water, right? You pour water from one glass to another, it's still just water, even if it's in different shapes.
Hmm.
But if you break your phone enough, you don't have 2 phones, do you?
Yeah, it's broken. It's just pieces now.
So, what's the deal with this? Why do some things seem countable, like individual things, while others seem more like measurable, continuous stuff?
It really is a fundamental intuition we have about how the world is structured.
And this deep dive we're doing right now, this is going to get into that basic intuition we have about stuff versus things. That's what we're exploring today.
It's amazing how deeply embedded this distinction seems to be, even before we have the words for it. All those examples you just gave, they really highlight this basic way we categorize the world.
Totally. And it's not just some random, thought experiment. This stuff gets right into some big, deep questions in philosophy.
Definitely. It goes beyond just the everyday.
Like philosophers have this term for this whole area of thought. It's called the metaphysics of mass expressions. Might sound a little jargony, but what it really means is thinking about how the way we talk, especially the difference between, mass nouns like water or gold and count nouns like horse or table, how that gets us asking some really big questions about the nature of reality itself.
If we kind of zoom out for a second, you can see how this seemingly simple linguistic difference, mass nouns versus count nouns, has really fueled centuries of debate about whether the universe is ultimately made up of like these separate individual things, or if it's more like this continuous, undefined sort of primal stuff at its core.
So that's the mission for this deep dive. We want to, we want you, the listener, to really get a handle on this philosophical battle between stuff and things. But we're not going to get bogged down in the super technical jargon. We want to get to those aha moments, those surprising insights that philosophers come up with when they're trying to unpack the very fabric of reality.
I think one of the most fascinating questions that comes out of this is our language, this tool we use to communicate, is it actually a reliable guide to the true nature of the world? It's a question that keeps popping up as we dig deeper into this.
Yeah, exactly. So here's the plan for this deep dive. First, we're going to dig deeper into this intuitive sense we have about stuff and things and how that shows up in our language. And then we'll check out some of the main philosophical takes on what these mass expressions, things like, the air in the room, actually refer to. And then lastly, we'll think about whether language can really be trusted as a map of what's truly real.
Ready to get into it?
Let's do this. Let's unpack this intuition about stuff and things a bit further. So think about how kids, little kids, first start to learn about the world, right? They point at a furry thing, someone says dog, point at a bunch of little grains, it's sand. And even before they have the words, there's this sense, this philosopher Tyler Burge, he talked about this sense of like distinct, separate objects versus things that are kind of shapeless, more like a material that can change. Kids learn to count the objects and measure the stuff. Objects feel solid, stable. Stuff feels more, fluid.
That's fascinating. So there's this pre-linguistic awareness, this way of experiencing the world that seems to map onto the linguistic categories of, mass nouns and count nouns. We have mass nouns like nitrogen, porridge, even abstract concepts like information or garbage, right? And then the count nouns, horse, futon, army. But we should keep in mind the focus for us today is not just on the single words, but also on these phrases, these mass expressions like the water in the lake or the steel in that girder.
It's a subtle but important distinction.
It is.
So let's get into how these categories actually play out in language, like the grammar, right? The way they work in sentences, that tells us a lot. Count nouns, you can use them with words like each, every, few, fewer, many, a. You wouldn't naturally say like each water or a nitrogen in the same way you'd say, each horse or a futon.
Right. Mass nouns, they have their own set of quantifiers. Much, little, a lot of, less, more. You'd say much water or a little nitrogen, but not much horse or a little futon. That just sounds off.
Exactly. And then there's how we use numbers in plurals. We say 1 horse, 5 horses, no problem. But 1 water, 5 waters, well, that usually means you're talking about different kinds of water, right?
Like different brands of bottled water or different bodies of water.
Yeah. And this philosopher, Jeff Pelletier, he pointed out that even when we say something like 6 beers, we're usually talking about like 6 servings of beer bottles, glasses, whatever.
So the way we structure our sentences, the grammar itself, it seems to mirror this basic conceptual division between stuff and things.
It does. And what about the word some? It does something interesting with mass nouns. Like if you say she drank some wine, it kind of feels like you're using an indefinite article, right? Almost like you're saying she drank a wine.
You're right, it does. Some wine almost functions as a singular unit in that context.
And you can use the with both mass and count nouns. The horse, the water. But, and this is where it gets philosophical, there's actually a debate about whether the water, when you're talking about stuff, actually refers to one single unified thing in the same way that the horse in the stable does.
Some philosophers really question whether phrases like the water in the vase really pick out a single distinct individual in the world, like a thing, like a horse or a cat.
Right. And here's where things get even more interesting. Philosophers have tried to categorize mass nouns based on the type of reality they seem to point to. So you have like concrete, quasi-mass terms like furniture or silverware. Grammatically, they're mass nouns, but they obviously refer to collections of individual things, right?
Yeah, furniture isn't some mysterious substance. It's tables, chairs, sofas, and so on.
And then there's concrete mass, the stuff that feels more like a continuous, like undifferentiated matter, things like water, iron, porridge. And then you also get abstract mass nouns like information or wisdom, and psychological mass like pain or admiration. And there's also quantitative mass, things like speed and weight.
So many categories. But it seems like the real philosophical heavy lifting when it comes to this stuff versus things debate, it really centers on the concrete and quasi-concrete examples, right?
Totally. Like as the Stanford Encyclopedia entry points out, not many philosophers are going to try to build a grand theory of stuff based on the word furniture. It's the words like water and gold that really get them going, spark those deeper metaphysical questions.
So water, gold, that's where the action is.
Right. And for the rest of our deep dive, that's what we're focusing on. Those concrete and quasi-concrete mass nouns. That's where the real heart of the debate lies. The other categories, they're fascinating in their own right, but they lead to a whole different set of questions that we'll have to explore another time.
So we've established this intuitive and linguistic divide between stuff and things. Now, how do philosophers actually grapple with this? Where do they go from here?
So in contemporary analytic metaphysics, the dominant view for a long time has been thing theory. Basically, the idea is that everything that concretely exists is either a thing, a separate countable individual, or can be broken down into a collection of those fundamental things. So you've got folks like Peter Strawson, he was big on singular reference, W.V. Quine, who focused on quantifying over objects and sets, and John Heil, who famously said the world is a world of objects. This idea even goes back to Aristotle.
So if you're a thing theorist, how do you make sense of all the ways we talk about stuff?
Well, they'd say that when we talk about stuff, we're really just talking about things, just in a disguised way. So water is really just a bunch of individual water molecules. Sand is just a lot of individual grains of sand, maybe thought of as a set or a collection.
So it's a way of trying to fit everything into this things framework.
Right. But then you've got the opposite view, what are called stuff ontologies. These folks, they take stuff seriously as a basic fundamental aspect of reality, maybe even more fundamental than things. They might say that things actually come from stuff, or that both things and stuff are equally fundamental and can't be reduced to each other.
So what are the big reasons why philosophers feel the need to make this distinction between stuff and things at such a deep level? I mean, beyond just the way we use language.
Good question. There are a few key intuitions at play here. First, think about the history of a particular chunk of stuff. The water that makes up a snowball, it was water way before it was part of that snowball, right?
Yeah, and it could be water again after the snowball melts.
Exactly. And think about how things persist when they change. Scatter a pile of wood, you still have wood, just arranged differently. But take apart a desk, you don't have a desk anymore.
So there's a difference in how they persist through change. The wood doesn't depend on a particular arrangement in the same way that the dust does.
And then there's this idea of cumulativity. You add water to water, you just have more water. But you add two cars together, you don't have like a mega car, not in the same way.
Right. 1 + 1 = 2 doesn't seem to work the same way with stuff.
And dissectivity. Divide water, you still have water. Divide a flower, you don't have flowers anymore.
Okay. Those are good points. And then there's this idea of, what was it called? Extended simple objects.
Ooh, yeah, that's a trippy one. Like, could there be an object that takes up space but has no smaller parts?
So it's one solid thing, no internal structure.
Right. If so, there wouldn't be any things making it up, but there'd still be stuff there. And if you divided it, the parts wouldn't have been there before the division, unlike with a pile of sand or something. It would be like the stuff itself is fundamental, not the parts.
So these are all strong intuitions that challenge the idea that everything is ultimately just things or made of things. Now let's go back to how thing theorists try to account for stuff talk. You mentioned viewing stuff as a kind of thing, or actually as many things.
Right. So one way they do this is through this idea of mereological sums, like wholes made up of parts. So when we say snow is white, a sum theorist might say this means that the sum of all the snow is part of the sum of all white things. Or like the water is in the tub becomes there's a fusion of water molecules that's in the tub.
So they're trying to translate our talk about stuff into talk about sums, which they'd say are still, in a way, things.
Yeah, that's the idea. They want to show that when we talk about matter, what we're really referring to are specific portions of matter, sums of matter, which are always particular countable entities, at least in principle.
But this immediately raises the question, which collections of stuff count as a genuine mereological sum, a thing in itself?
That's a big debate in mereology. Like, when do two or more things actually compose a new unified thing? You have extremes like compositional nihilism, which says never, and then mereological universalism, which says always. Any collection of things, no matter how random, makes a single object. So like your coffee cup and a galaxy far, far away, they'd make one big, weird object.
That definitely pushes the boundaries of what we normally think of as an object.
It does. But the argument for unrestricted mereology, or AMA, is that it's simple and it's not arbitrary. Now, if you apply this to matter, you get this principle of unrestricted fusion of matter.
Yeah.
Any two bits of matter, no matter how small or far apart, have a mereological sum.
And what's the reasoning behind that? Why would that be the case?
Well, there's this idea of summativity. Like, if you've got two masses of the same stuff, their sum is just a bigger mass of that stuff. Like the water example again. You divide it, put it back together, it's still just water.
So it seems counterintuitive to say that the water only becomes an object when it's all together, right?
Right. And then there's this principle of generality matters, the most basic, most general kind of stuff. So the thinking goes, any two portions of matter have to have a fusion.
And this brings us to the concept of mere sums.
Yeah, so mere sums, they're composite things, meaning they're made of parts, and they exist only if their parts exist. They persist over time only if the same parts keep existing. They don't have to have any like inherent unity or cohesion or purpose. They're just the sum of their parts. So the idea is that matter, for a mereologist, is just these mere sums.
But can these mereological sums of matter gain or lose parts and still be the same sum?
Yeah.
That seems important.
Totally. Like if you pour out some water, the water that's left, it's still the same water in some sense, right? This brings us to the idea of mereological essentialism for masses. If something is a part of a mass of matter, that mass can only exist if that specific part is there. No swapping parts allowed.
That sounds like a pretty strict view.
It is. But the argument is that masses of matter, they're fundamentally defined by their parts at any given time. Like imagine a sum made up of 9 fundamental particles. If you destroy one and the remaining 8 form another sum, is it the same sum? Mereological essentialism says no.
So if a regular object, like a table, can have parts swapped out, but these fundamental sums of matter can't, how do those two things relate to each other?
That's where things get tricky. One possibility is coincidence, where the sum of the matter making up the table is a different thing from the table itself, even though they share the same parts at that moment. Or you could go with elimination and say regular objects, like we normally think of them, they don't really exist, just these constantly changing sums of matter. Or there's dual category views, which say sums and regular objects are totally different kinds of entities. None of these options is without problems.
And what about the idea that sums of stuff could be like infinitely divisible with no smallest part.
That's something philosophers like Gotthard Link and Harry Bunt have explored. They argue that the best way to think about how we use mass terms is to treat them as referring to things that are infinitely divisible, whether they actually are made of fundamental particles or not. This often leads to the idea that sums of matter and the objects they make up, they often coincide.
So a different way to think about mass expressions is to say they refer to sets of things. How does that work?
The idea here is that a mass term, like the wine on the table, really means the set of wine molecules on the table, or the gold in the crown is the set of gold atoms making up the crown. One nice thing about this view is that it might get around that coincidence problem. The set of gold atoms isn't the same thing as the crown. One's a set, the other's a concrete object.
So it's another way to try and reduce talk about mass to talk about collections, which fits nicely into a thing theory worldview.
Yeah. But the problem, and it's a big one, is that sets are usually thought of as abstract outside of space and time. But gold, wine, those are definitely concrete things. How can a concrete thing be the same as an abstract set? Plus, a set isn't the same as its members. But the gold in a ring, it just is those gold atoms. It's not just a set containing them.
There's been an attempt to deal with this by talking about non-abstract sets of physical objects, right?
Yeah, like maybe these sets can have physical properties by proxy. The set of gold atoms weighs something because its members together weigh that amount. But this kind of just ends up being talk about the members themselves, the atoms. So why even bother with the set? Just talk about the gold atoms directly.
Seems simpler that way. And there are more problems for this set theoretic view, aren't there?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Jeff Pelletier points out that there are so many ways to divide up a portion of stuff, packets, bottles, whatever, and each way would give you a different set of parts. This can lead to contradictions. And, typical set theory assumes everything can be broken down into, like, basic indivisible units. But what about stuff that seems infinitely divisible, like a gunk, or things like fruitcake or beer, where it's not clear what the smallest atom would even be? Take a perfect Jell-O cube, right? If it's infinitely divisible, how do you pin down the exact set of parts that make it up? It gets really messy. As Dean Zimmerman said, trying to match up concrete matter with infinite sets of sets, it's enough to give you vertigo.
So, the masses assets theory has its issues. What about this other idea, that mass expressions refer to many things, not one thing? This approach using pluralities and plural reference.
Okay, so this view, it uses plural logic, developed by guys like George Boulos and Thomas McKay, and it basically says that when we use mass terms, we're referring to multiple individual items at once, not one big blob of stuff. So gold wouldn't be a single substance, but rather all those individual gold things, maybe gold atoms or particles.
So something like the water is boiling would really be saying, those water molecules are boiling.
That's the gist of it, yeah. Henry Laycock was an early proponent of this view, and then David Nicholas developed it further. This seems to work pretty well for those quasi-mass nouns like silverware, which clearly refers to a bunch of separate forks, spoons, and knives. Pluralists argue that plural reference is ontologically innocent, meaning, like, if you say those cats, you're not committed to some extra entity called the cats existing along with the individual cats.
So that's a plus compared to sum and set theories, which do seem to introduce new kinds of entities into our picture of reality.
It is. Laycock even drew comparisons between mass terms like water and plural terms like hobbits. They both have cumulative reference. They resist pluralization. They don't usually take a in front of them. They do take the and some, and they work with words that talk about dividing things up.
But I'm sure there are differences between mass terms and plural terms.
Oh, for sure. Like if you say there are peppercorns in the sauce, you can logically conclude that there's at least one peppercorn in there. But from there is wine in the sauce, you can't conclude that there's at least one non-kind wine. And most plural terms have a singular form, like cats and cat, while mass terms like water or silverware, they usually don't.
And how does this pluralist view handle the tricky stuff, the non-atomic or fuzzy stuff?
Yeah, that's a tough one for them. If fruitcake refers to many things, what exactly are those individual things? It faces a similar problem as the set theory with the Jell-O cube. If there's no clear way to say what the smallest parts are, what exactly are the pluralities we're talking about? Some pluralists are working on solutions using like vagueness logic or stuff from non-well-founded set theory, but it's still a work in progress.
So all these approaches, sums, sets, pluralities, they're all attempts to make stuff fit into a worldview that's ultimately focused on things.
Right.
But there are philosophers who say stuff is just different from things, period.
Right, and that takes us into some even more radical philosophical territory. Time to ditch thing theory.
So let's talk about the serious pluralities idea. How is it different from those ontologically innocent pluralities we talked about earlier?
Okay, so the difference is serious pluralists like Laycock in some of his work and Michael Burke, they argue that there's a whole new category of plural entities. These aren't just individual things that we happen to be grouping together. They're like real in their own right. Laycock, for example, he said that when you use a definite reference with a mass expression like that water, you're not talking about a single thing, but a concrete but not particular reality of stuff. It's not a set or a sum, it's its own thing.
Okay, so what's the motivation for this stronger view of pluralities?
For Laycock, it's connected to rejecting unrestricted Mariology. He says a formless, concrete plurality, like a blob of water before it gets a specific shape, it doesn't have the unity to be a mereological object. And Burke, he was partly motivated by the coincidence problem. He said that the copper that makes up a statue is a plurality, not one copper object, so you avoid having two different objects in the same place.
But critics have pointed out that this idea of a concrete, non-particular thing, it's not clear what that actually adds.
Yeah, it's hard to say what this new category is doing and why, like, a bunch of lions wouldn't be a serious plurality the same way water is. It seems like it creates this special status for stuff pluralities that doesn't apply to other kinds. And even Laycock himself kind of moved away from this view later on.
And then there's the most radical departure from the thing theory, this world stuff idea. What's that all about?
So this is a view pushed by people like Alan Siddell and John Horgan and Matt Potra. They basically say that there are no fundamental things, just this big blob of world stuff. What we think of as objects, those are just temporary patterns or like conceptual cookie cutters that we impose on this underlying reality.
So a tree, it wouldn't be a real thing, but just a temporary arrangement of this world stuff.
Right. And Siddell argues that when we talk about different substances, we're picking out what we consider to be objects based on these like contingent accidental properties, but underneath there's this more basic stuff. So what we usually see as a change in substance, like a sweater unraveling, it's really just a change in the arrangement of this basic world stuff. And he thinks the coincidence problem comes from the fact that the world itself doesn't tell us how to divide things up into objects. How we do that, he says, depends on our interests and how we think about the world.
So it's like the world doesn't come pre-sliced into objects.
Right. And Siddell says the problem is assuming that objects exist in the first place. He thinks we should describe the world without talking about separate things and focus on this world stuff that causes our perceptions.
It's a huge shift in thinking. But, some people have said this sounds a lot like some of Quine's views, where any chunk of space-time could be an object. You're just calling it something different.
That's a good point. If you can just rephrase talk about world stuff as talk about space-time chunks being objects, then it might be more about words than about, the actual nature of reality. And it's kind of weird to think that not just regular objects, but also stuff like water molecules or even atoms are just conceptual carvings on this world stuff. If you take that logic all the way, you might even end up saying that fundamental particles are just concepts too, and that feels like you're making claims about physics based on philosophy, which can be dangerous territory.
And while this world stuff idea has some overlap with certain ways of thinking about physics.
Yeah, like with mass energy, quantum fields, the nature of space-time. But like the Stanford Encyclopedia entry warns us that these are all super complex and debated topics in physics. We should be careful about jumping to big metaphysical conclusions based on them. We don't really have it all figured out yet.
So this whole discussion has relied heavily on the distinction between mass nouns and count nouns. And the last part of the entry asks a really important question. After all this philosophical work, can we really rely on this simple grammatical distinction to make strong claims about the nature of reality?
That's a crucial question to ask after going through all these different theories. For decades, philosophers have often used the fact that a word is a mass noun or a count noun to argue for or against certain beliefs about what exists. The assumption is that either our language tells us something about the true structure of reality, or that it limits what we can think about reality.
But the entry highlights some big problems with putting too much faith in this linguistic distinction.
Yeah, for one thing, there's this constant interchangeability. As that rather dark song from Sweeney Todd shows, even words that usually refer to people can be used as mass nouns in some contexts. And Jeff Pelletier has shown that almost every mass noun can be used as a count noun, and vice versa. often without even changing the word itself. Like you can say, there's more mark now after someone gains weight.
Right. So it seems like many nouns aren't stuck in one category or the other. They can be both, depending how they're used.
Exactly. And if a word can switch between being a mass noun and a count noun, then just knowing if it's plus mass or plus count, that doesn't seem to tell us as much as we thought it did about the deep nature of things.
And then there's the issue that different languages categorize the world in different ways.
Yeah, that's a big one. Like, why is fruit usually a mass noun in English, but in other languages it has a count equivalent? There are a bunch of examples of this in the chart in the entry. Even in English, it seems kind of random that fruit is mass, but vegetables is count.
Right. So it doesn't seem like there's something about the things themselves that forces us to use a mass or count noun. And if it's arbitrary in language, can we really say it reflects some deep, non-arbitrary truth about reality?
And maybe the biggest challenge of all is that this mass count distinction, it's not even universal across all languages.
That's a key point for anyone who wants to make grand claims about how humans think based on the grammar of English. Early critics of Strawson already pointed out that this distinction isn't so clear in other languages. Some linguists say that, for example, Mandarin Chinese doesn't have count nouns like we do, or that languages like Hopi or some Salishan languages don't have mass nouns. Even in languages like Denisuyini and some Amazonian languages, it's not clear if they have a mass count distinction at all.
So if this supposedly basic linguistic feature isn't even universal, can we really use it to draw conclusions about how all of humanity categorizes the world?
The entry introduces the idea of a mass count skeptic, someone who doesn't think this distinction is a strong basis for doing metaphysics, because it seems arbitrary, things can move between categories, and it's not universal. This doesn't mean we should give up thinking about the nature of stuff and things, just that this specific linguistic feature might not be the best tool for the job.
So it looks like after all this philosophical investigation, the connection between mass and count nouns and the real nature of stuff and things is turning out to be way more complicated than we might have thought.
Definitely. The author of the entry suggests that these big debates about the nature of reality are definitely important, but the mass count distinction might not be the best way to settle them. But there's a lot of cool empirical research happening in linguistics right now, and maybe future discoveries about how the mass count distinction works in our minds and in language will shed more light on these philosophical puzzles.
So we're not done figuring this whole stuff and things business out.
Not at all. We've just scratched the surface here. It's a rich, complex, and ongoing area of philosophy.
And that brings us to a final thought for you, our listener. Given all this linguistic variety and all the philosophical complexity we've explored, do you think our everyday distinction between stuff and things reflects a fundamental truth about reality itself? Or is it maybe just a really useful way for our language to help us make sense of the world? We encourage you to think about how this might change your own understanding of the objects and materials you encounter every day.
Definitely food for thought. And we encourage you to keep exploring these ideas. Check out Mariology, Plural Logic, the works of the philosophers we mentioned. Think about the mass and count nouns in your own language and what assumptions might be hidden in how you use them.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's giving you a new perspective on these seemingly simple but surprisingly deep categories of stuff and things.